you so much, Professor Massiliani, for this invitation and this opportunity to discuss these issues of diversity and inclusion to the equity, inclusion, and diversity. I think universities are trying to do something about this. And it is a good thing that we even have a Black History Month and that people are tuning in to learn more and to be open to and willing to discuss these issues. Thinking of Negritude thinkers in the 20s and 30s in France, I think historically they have done the work that Black Lives Matter are trying to do today. And, when they were in Paris in the 30s, they met thinkers of the Harlem Renaissance. And those thinkers of the Harlem Renaissance, they were free. But Aime Cesaire, Léopold Sédar Senghor, Damas, as students, were still colonized subjects. So they were trying to understand how to get out of colonialism and how to reclaim their Black dignity. So in doing so, they started talking to thinkers of the Harlem Renaissance. And the word Negritude comes from the Harlem Renaissance. That's where Césaire coined the word for the first time. And so I'm specifically going to talk about Césaire's work here, because I think Césaire, all of them actually, Senghor, Leopold, Damas also, excuse me, they have done the work historically to show how it's important to give dignity to Black bodies. Let me start with a quote with Aime Cesaire himself. I quote, "I am talking of millions of men who have been skillfully injected with fear, inferiority complexes, trepidation, servility, despair, abasement." And then Frantz Fanon said in French, parler, c'est exister absolument pour l'autre. To speak is to exist for the other. And then Che Guevara said, la solidarité des faibles. Solidarity is for the weak ones. So today, in the second decade of the 21st century, after the first Black president of the United States, the violent events of Ferguson, Missouri, and Staten Island, New York, as well as continuing nationwide protests by NFL players, racial politics clearly remain at the core of American life. As you can see, I'm talking about the events that happened even before George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. Black Lives Matter became very important after 2020 because of what happened in the US. I will talk about it later. So issues of police brutality, mass incarceration, and interpersonal violence have been at the forefront of discourse surrounding the political and social direction of the country and its citizens. These ills all have origins in history and memory, origins that have been often overlooked, if not erased. And I think, when I'm talking about overlooked, if not erased, so I think Black History Month are those moments where we try to bring those voices back to history. Thinking more about the role of academics as political agents, I found that drawing out of these longer histories of oppression and resistance is a large part of how we can make sense of the world for ourselves and our students. Today, I examine how the Black Lives Matter movement continues to the struggle for dignity that Aime Cesaire and other thinkers were already demanding in the 20s and 30s. That is to say, the basic quest for the humanity of people around the world. Aime Cesaire wrote about, negritude, and he talks about how negritude is for everyone around the world who is oppressed. To read Césaire's work in light of recent events and Black Lives Matter is to bear witness to the history of ongoing struggles of Black people around the world. Although Césaire's work is rooted in the history of Blackness, while Black Lives Matter deals with the current situation of police brutality, they both demonstrate how Black people have been dehumanized by slavery and colonialism, and the subsequent ongoing struggle to be considered human as a Black person. Born in the northern city of Basse Pointe on the island of Martinique in 1913, to a family of impoverished farmers, Aimé Césaire would become the most important Francophone Caribbean writers of his time. A product of the French colonial educational system, he was well-versed in French letters, even as he was deeply familiar with the West African traditions of his community. After completing his studies in Martinique, he received a scholarship to study in Paris, where he arrived in 1931. So there he met these three thinkers that they call the thinkers of the Negritude thinkers. So you have Aimé Césaire, Léon Gontran Damas, and Léopold Sédar Senghor. Unfortunately, I don't know how to. So Césaire in Paris met Léon Gontran Damas from the French Guyana and Léopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal. Together, these three poets voiced their opposition to French assimilation policies, even as they explore the richness of their Black communities and African roots. In 1934, they launched L'Étudiant Noir, a magazine that offered a forum in which Black students could define their complex, connected, and largely ignored past in their own terms. The Black Lives Matter movement, which brings attention to police brutality against young Black American men, emerged in the United States in 2012 after George Zimmerman, a white vigilante, was acquitted of the killing of the young Black man, Trayvon Martin. I'm sure everyone heard about Trayvon Martin around the world. His name, like George Floyd, is called everywhere in people's lips. And for George Floyd, for example, it's really painful to see that. I think he changed the course of history. I think Trayvon Martin as well, but I also still feel that we see the pictures, but we don't know anything about their lives. They are dehumanized again for me. We just see them as, icons of resistance, icons that allow people to raise their voice and demand their rights. But we don't know that they were humans before. So that's quite interesting to me. So so Black Lives Movement recognizes the 1992 Los Angeles riots and the subsequent trial of Rodney King, as well as the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, as flashpoints that laid bare the racial inequality that is at the heart of everyday life in America. Since its inception as an organization in 2012, Black Lives Matter has taken up the issues of mass incarceration and police brutality. The movement organized nationwide around the killing of Trayvon Martin, as well as the many other young men and women. Remember that Claudia Rankine, an African-American poet, Claudia Rankine, In her book, Citizen, an American Lyric, I quote, Russell Davis, Tamira Rice, Walter Scott, Frieda Gray. When she wrote this book, she did not talk about George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. But I think if she has to rewrite it, she will add many, many more names. There's so many more names here that I will only say a few of them. They're all victims of police brutality. End of quote. The organization uses new forms of social media to demand that Black people be treated as human beings, but its call for the acknowledgement of the dignity of Black people is part of the tradition that can be traced to literature from the United States, Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa, and which has been an important part of Black culture since at least the 19th century. From slavery to colonialism to apartheid, violence against Black bodies has been well documented, and yet it often remains invisible to many, as its perpetration is controlled by dominant discourses. In some respects, social media has changed this. For now, we all can participate in its creation. Anyone can snap a picture that has the potential to circulate globally. While this can make images of violence commonplace, organizations such as Black Lives Matter have begun to use this new technology to continue the fight for Black dignity. For Black intellectuals of earlier generations, this was not the case. They had to engage with the dominant discourses through their theorizing and writing. It is so clear that for the thinkers of the Negritude movement, they had to theorize and read so much. Today, it took few seconds for this young person to snap a picture of the police killing George Floyd, 1 second, and then put it around the world. I think as painful as it is, so many people have seen this image circulating around the world. In the English-speaking world, many are familiar with writers such as Ralph Ellison, who in his novel Invisible Man offers a reading of the erasure of the identity of the Black man in the profoundly racist Southern United States of the 1950s. It is a work of genius, broad in its appeal for a true brotherhood of man and universal in its quest for an identity rooted in the nation. The erased narrator of Invisible Man is a young African-American man living in the segregation of the Deep South. In his imagination, he believes himself to be an invisible man, a Black man whose identity does not exist. He is invisible in the gaze of the other. As he explores what this means, he finds his destiny and that of all Americans are intimately linked. Blacks and whites are connected by a story of hatred. I think one person who also says this clearly is James Baldwin. James Baldwin wrote a letter to his nephew in 1956, I believe. My dungeon shook, a letter to my nephew, and he talks about how he tells his nephew that, the American destiny is connected by hatred, history of hatred, and that is through love that this will stop. You have to love your other brothers. They may hate you, but you have to learn to love them. So that also is very poignant that, Ralph Ellison wrote this, and then James Baldwin later comes back to the same issue. Many other African American writers have shared Ellison's emphasis on invisibility and the inextricable fates of Black and white Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois evokes a world of similar fantasies, while Richard Wright writes of a hidden world in the man who lived underground. So in addition, since the death of Trevor Martin, many scholars have returned to the work of James Baldwin as a source of inspiration, as I was saying before. This includes Jasmine Ward's The Fire Next Time, A New Generation Speaks About Race, 2016. These are incredible books to read now. Ta-Nehisi quotes Between the World and Me, 2015. And he kind of rewrite the letter that James Baldwin wrote to his nephew. He wrote a letter to his son in that book. Claudia Rankins, and as cited before, Citizen, An American Lyric, 2014. And there's also a very interesting film by Raoul Peck entitled I Am Not Your Negro, 2017. And Raoul Peck did an incredible work of documenting all the protest speech that James Baldwin gave throughout his life. And it's an incredible document. Using Baldwin's reflections as a starting point, these works record the long history of race relations in the US and discuss the continued racism visited upon Black bodies. While a great many American writers and thinkers have reflected on Blackness in the United States, English speakers would also be well served to consider the work of Aime Cesaire and the other Negritude thinkers. They will complement reflections on race in this era of Black Lives Matter. In 1959, Samuel W. Allen, the poet-verser, drew a similar conclusion about bringing African and African-American reflections on race in dialogue with each other, saying, I quote, "It would appear that the American Negro, like the African, has an imposing interest in the development of his image in the universe, in the correction of the distorted image of himself in the society," end of quote. The role of the African writer in correcting and articulating an autonomous Black identity in light of the historical oppressions is certainly present in Césaire's conception of negritude. As Nick Nesbitt comments in discussing Césaire's idea of the role of the intellectual in history, I quote, "It is the poet or l'homme de culture, the man of culture, who must effect change upon a largely passive, receptive, and subordinated people," end of quote. For Césaire, the struggle for a Black identity, as well as cultural and ideological production, moves from top down rather than vice versa. I don't know if you can read this quote now. There's all these things in between, but I will read it like this. It was during his time in Paris in the 30s that the seeds for Césaire's most famous poem, Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal, Notebook of the Return to the Motherland, were planted. First appearing in the 1939 in the Parisian Revue Volonté, Notebook of the Return to the Native Land was published in book form in 1947 in New York, together with a laboratory preface by the surrealist André Breton. The epic poem's dazzling syntactical and lexical inventiveness combines elements of African and Haitian history. And there is a similar link between Haitian history, the French Revolution, and its post-colonial ramification. Césaire wrote also a very interesting book on Haiti. And unfortunately, that book has not been translated. He discusses the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution in detail. So if you read French, that's a very good book to read. So I think I wanted to read this in French, but I'm going to try and see if I can read this.
Quotation from the Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal. My negritude is not a stone, its deafness hurled against the clamor of the day. My negritude is not a leucoma of dead liquid over the earth's dead eye. My negritude is neither tower nor cathedral. It takes root in the red flesh of soil. It takes root in the ardent flesh of the sky. It breaks through opaque prostration with its upright patience.
Thank you so much. All right, so there's a scholar called Thomas A. Hare. He has noted, I quote, it seems to announce both, this poem seems to announce both the end of the entre-deux-guerres, the between-guerre genesis of this vigorous new literature and the dawn of the sharpened diasporic consciousness in the Black world, end of quote. Indeed, it was the Surrealist poet André Breton who first called international attention to the work of Césaire. One edition, André Breton called the publication of the poem in Paris and New York in 1947. Another highly visible French intellectual, Jean-Paul Sartre, declared in a landmark preface to Senghor's anthology of poetry from the African diaspora that Césaire was by far the most promising of the new generation of Black poets. It was in Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal that Césaire first used the word negritude, which came to signify the aesthetic and literary movement that affirmed the values of African culture and heritage, and which today is associated with the work Césaire, Senghor, and Damas have been doing, or did, because they're no longer here. The neologism is a Latinized version of the South American derogatory word for Black, negrismo. It appears in these lines that, my colleague just read to you, that I still have on the screen. By defining first what negritude is not, Césaire makes clear that he will define the word on his own terms. It is not a negative entity, a void or vacuum. It is not defined in relation to something else. To the contrary, it has roots which have taken hold despite the winds of history and planted themselves in the earth and the sky. What's more, it is both corporal, rooted in flesh, and spiritual, the flesh of the earth and the sky. When we acknowledge these roots, we can see negritude in all its power, not only because it connects the earth to the heaven, but also because it has been tempered and strengthened by the experience of suffering. While Césaire gives poetic voice to a concept that for too long had been defined by the exoticizing Western gaze, he's also developing philosophical concepts grounded in historical reality. So I have another, can you read it too? Césaire writes,
Césaire writes, negritude is not a metaphysic. Negritude is not a pretentious conception of the universe. It is a way of experiencing history in history. The history of a community whose experience appears to be singular, with its deportations, its transport of men from one continent to another, its memory of distant beliefs, the wreckage of its murdered cultures. How can we not believe that all this has a coherence constituting a patrimony?
Thank you. So indeed, negritude was founded upon the notion that there is a certain quality common to the thoughts and to the behavior of Black people. As Jean-Paul Sartre wrote in Black Orpheus, his preface to Senghor's 1948 Anthologie de la Nouvelle Poésie Nègre et Malgache. This shared quality of Blackness not only allowed Blacks to see themselves through their own eyes, but also incited them to determine for themselves what this quality consists of. In this sense, the Negritude movement gave Blacks the ability to demonstrate to whites that it was now the Blacks to return the gaze upon them. So can you read again Sartre's words here? I want you to feel.
I want you to feel, as I, the sensation of being seen. For the white man has enjoyed it for 3,000 years, the privilege of seeing without being seen. Today, these Black men have fixed their gaze upon us, and our gaze is thrown back in our eyes.
Thank you. At last, Black people were proclaiming, we exist and our humanity matters. We can see you, we can speak for ourselves, and our lives matter. For Césaire, the acceptance of one's negritude was the means by which the decolonization of the mind, as the Kenyan intellectual Ngugi wa Thiong'o would later put it, could be achieved. Césaire emphasized the power of the collective memory, reminding us that we must not forget the history of enslavement and colonialism, which has sharpened diasporic consciousness for Black people around the world. For him, negritude emerged from another quote, please. Can you read this one?
If les nègres were not a people, let us say a defeated, or indeed an unfortunate, unhappy people, a humiliated people, etc., if we could invert history and make them the conquerors, then I believe for my part that negritude would not have come to be.
Thank you. Once upon a time, the Blacks inhabited their homeland, an entire continent, and then they were enslaved and their lands were colonized. They were denied a past, a present, a future, and even a language of their own. It is from the struggle to regain these essential human elements, a past, present, a future, and a language in which to express themselves, that negritude was born to create within the Francophone world a modern Black subject. This leads us to ask, who was or is this subject? Here again, we can return to Césaire. The movement between terms negritude, Black, and other is, of course, important. For Césaire, Africa remains a defining historical term, shaping identities over time. He suggests that Black identity is constructed with a fragmented African subject as its very core. For example, the very term African American outlines a potent bond between Black men and women in the Americas and their historical progenitors in Africa, brought across the Atlantic Ocean over centuries of slavery. As such, the Black modern subject found that their modernity has been formed within the grids of historical oppression and subjugation, and further, that these grids morphed into power structures that compel the Black modern subject to become subjective, forced to live in between spaces, to hide, to be constantly afraid of being killed. The bond between African and American is, for many, a fragile one. For some, such a history of fragmentation and migration can only be set forth in fragmentary terms, an endless production of images, of shattered memory, and endless longing for wholeness within the frame of modernity. Significantly, this cultural production takes place in different forms and spaces by talented men and women, was long excluded from modern spaces. The racial term Black, for many today, best represents a spectrum of vision that contributes to newness and difference, although clearly many elements in the discourse are ongoing, intense, and diverse. From Blackness rises a range of alternative visions, by turns resistant and aspirational, of what modernity comprises. Part of the power of this vision stems from the necessary and radical rethinking of this past, an element that Césaire insisted upon. He contended that we must return to the violence of slavery and colonialism for a powerful, self-determining Black modern subject to emerge. In recalling violence along with the traditions of common ancestors and by defining the social context created by slavery and colonialism, African traditions allow access to different mythologies and epistemologies than the ones the West imposed. Indeed, establishing a Black identity was central to Césaire's understanding of slavery and colonialism as a basis of oppression. First, he insisted on the global scope of negritude, as Mante Diawara reminds us in his book, In Search of Africa, when he notes that, please read again.
The idea that negritude was bigger even than Africa, that we were part of an international moment which held the promise of universal emancipation, that our destiny coincided with the universal freedom of workers and colonized people worldwide. All this gave us a bigger and more important identity than the ones previously available to us through kinship, ethnicity, and race.
Thank you. The West Indies, Africa, and Europe are all represented in Césaire's work, perhaps most notably in his trilogy of plays, The Tragedy of King Christophe, 1963, A Season in the Congo, 1966, and The Tempest, 1969, which he adapted from Shakespeare. In these works, he displays his vast knowledge of Africa's botanical, zoological, medical, and classical texts, as well as African and Creole terminology. Finally, he mixes European poets and thinkers into his rhythmic lines, putting them in the service of African oral tradition, which can easily be set to music. But most importantly, as a descendant of slaves, he demonstrates what we must revisit, the triangular slave trade, which is, simply put, the history of the Western world. Both the Black Lives Matter movement and Césaire document the disturbing ways in which racial violence has been repeated in the cultural imaginary despite the efforts of Black subjects to speak out against domination and violence. Why people of African descent have not been able to recover from the historical violence of slavery and colonialism, and how Blacks continue to be subjected daily to violence. In the words of Alicia Garza, one of the founders of the movement, again, I don't know if, oh, this were the plays, okay, sorry. Yeah, this is the Alicia Garcia. So, I don't know, can you see that quotation there?
Yeah, would you like me to read it?
Yeah, please, thank you.
Black Lives Matter is about how do we live in a world that dehumanizes us and still be human. The fight is not just being able to keep breathing as a human. The fight is actually to be able to walk down the street with your head held high and feel like I belong here, or I deserve to be here, or I just have a right to have a level of dignity.
Thank you. Césaire can help us answer these questions. How to live in a world that dehumanizes Black people by returning to history and drawing from it for sustenance. By remembering that Blackness can create a powerful community which can offer testament to each individual's unconditional right to live and thrive. By claiming the validity of perspectives that comes from the very experience of suffering, and by fighting against forces that have made this suffering systemic. We are at a historical moment in which we can choose inclusivity and critical thinking. We can remember the past, analyze the present. When Césaire declared, this is a book that Françoise Vergès has written. She interviewed Aime Cesaire. Césaire clearly said, the title is in French, Nègre je suis, nègre je reste. Black I am, and Black I will remain. He was addressing a similar moment. And by proclaiming his Blackness within that moment, he was announcing that he would live his past, his present, and his future as a fully embodied, critically minded Black modern subject. He would address the deeply repressive society that upheld white European achievement as its standards and bring into public consciousness the words, sounds, gestures, and images of Black culture. Césaire's work can therefore inform contemporary discourse on decolonization, race theory, and current political narrative about Black Lives Matter. It can offer promising approaches to the tenacity of domination and its effects. And it can be broadened to address other forms of violence, racism, sexism, homophobia, and I name more. Black men and women have become increasingly visible, palpably present because of the attention Black Lives Matter gives to daily violence. In so doing, it excavates the history of the oppression of Black people and questions the implications of the loss of each Black adult and child through the mechanism of violence within oppression. In short, the recuperative work of exposing that violence has been a core part of Black Lives Matter's project since its inception. So since 2020, the Black Lives Matter started in 2012, and they disappeared after, George Zimmerman came out of prison. People didn't talk about Black Lives Matter for a while. And then in 2020, after what happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we have seen a kind of revolution. Black Lives Matter. These three words have been seen around the world in the most obscure places. And I think the protests, so many people have been protesting, and they use Black Lives Matter to protest about issues they have locally. That has been also very interesting, how actually this has opened doors to allow people to protest about their own issues. Persistent cliches against young Black men continue to feed the imagination of some police officers as well as the public, who often refuse to look beyond this imaginary to history and its importance. This appears startling in the words of Derek Wilson, the police officer who shot Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. In an interview that happened in the New Yorker a year after the shooting, he said, I quote, we can't fix in 30 minutes what happened 30 years ago. We have to fix what is happening now. That is not my job as a police officer. I am not going to delve into people's lifelong history and figure out why they are feeling a certain way in a certain moment. End of quote. As Wilson's case so starkly demonstrates, this denial of the importance of history and the refusal to examine one's own perception continues to inflict violence upon Black citizens. This has been documented by Césaire as well as many other writers, thinkers, and artists. Today, Black Lives Matter continues to demonstrate this, how systemic racism and discrimination affect Black people. Yet, even while Black Lives Matter is deeply invested in exposing violence It is also devoted to constructing an archive to honor the lives lived and lost. Here, too, their work echoes the words of Césaire. Visiting a memorial site in Gorée Island in Senegal, Césaire wrote upon its walls, "We must never forget." He wrote this down. You know, it's important. We must never forget. Remembering history allows Black people to reaffirm their humanity, even as they address their loss. A loss that, as Rankin writes in her book, Citizen, continues to be inscribed upon Black bodies and Black skin. Until this memory and history are seen, acknowledged, and honored, the violence inflicted upon Black bodies will continue, and the dignity due to Black will be denied. Thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Frieda, for that wonderful talk. It was absolutely fantastic to hear you talk about how we can bring Césaire's ideas about negritude into the contemporary context. I'm sure, you know, as someone, as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, I teach Césaire, and there were lots of really interesting. I've got so many questions I would like to ask you. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. So if anybody would like to ask a question, please feel free to either type your question into the chat bar and I can read it out, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand and I'll invite you to unmute yourself and you can ask your question that way. But just to start us off, Frieda, I wanted to ask you about the role of aesthetics, and I'm thinking back to one of the earlier quotations you gave from Césaire when he talks about negritude as negritude is not a metaphysics, right? So negritude is a way of experiencing history in history. So negritude obviously has this you know, strong political function, but at the same time, negritude is also an aesthetics in Césaire, Senghor. Poetry and art have this potent capacity to create ruptures, to offer new ways of thinking, but also new sort of aesthetic forms that will create a sort of a disturbance in how Black lives, Black bodies have been conceived and perpetuated in the cultural imaginary. And I'm wondering what your views are on how we can take this idea of the aesthetic potential into our contemporary context. And in particular, in a kind of in a 21st century where in the UK, I'm sure in the US as well, the arts are increasingly sort of, you know, one has to champion the arts more and more, don't we? So I'm just wondering about, because this is something that a criticism that has perhaps been leveled at Césaire and others in the past is perhaps that their political thought remains to an extent elitist by virtue of the fact that it is overly abstract and aesthetic. And so I'm just wondering how you feel we can continue to mobilize the aesthetic in the contemporary world as a form of politics.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is an important question. In fact, when you know, I was going to write a total different paper about addressing like concrete issues of diversity, you know, equity and inclusion. But I decided to talk about this. You know, Senghor, you know, Leopold Sédar Senghor said, the art is what's going to save Africa, given the condition of the continent, right? Very rich or very poor, you know, the continent still does not extract its own anything. We're very dependent of what is going on. We're very dependent on the West. So Césaire said the only thing that's going to save us is art, and I think art is saving us. And Senghor himself, when he was in power, he did a lot to privilege the art. Aesthetic was important to him. He opened schools, dance for youngsters to be dancers, because it was important to dance and allow them to use their bodies. And and then he opens also a painting school, where that you still have them in Senegal, where they have so many beautiful artists, right? And they're saying something. They're also addressing, what we are addressing with words. They do, they're addressing that in the paintings, for example. And also musicians, aesthetic. I mean, there's a lot going on in the continent, but it's purely artistic, it's art. And it's art purely that is going to save us. And I think aesthetically too, even poetry, I kept citing Rankin, remember the three Negritude thinkers were poets. They started with aesthetics, right? They did politics later, but aesthetically, they were rooted in that. That's where they started. And I think it's helping us. We have more and more young poets. We have, because something is burgeoning, they have to do something. We have so many artists, beautiful artists, saying something with the art. So aesthetically, they use it. I think for me, for example, I use what, these philosophers have talked about in my own work, in my own art, in my own writing. So I think they're connected somehow. Yeah.
Thank you. Would anyone like to ask a question?
There's Laura has a question.
Laura, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes. Thank you very much, Frieda. And I'm an economist, so I'm moving away now from this beautiful conversation on art. I'm very interested in that, but I'm moving now away from that towards economics, if you don't mind, because I was interested by the quote of Vivara from 1996 that you showed us, and it was saying that the Negritude movement was also addressing the concern of the workers. Mm-hmm. And all over the world, and also in Césaire and the Negritude thinker, there is this kind of relationship with the Marxism and also communism, at least at the beginning, right? Yeah. So if you can say more how this kind of relationship comes from, whether it's for example, a reaction to colonialism, or is going back to their roots of solidarity somewhere from an ideal homeland. So I would like to know a little bit more about that. And then I have another question about the economic colonialism that Africa especially is experiencing nowadays. And you just mentioned briefly when you were answering Melina's question.
Yeah. Well, we have, we call it neo-colonialism, so we have Asians, particularly China in Africa. So, it has been said that's a new form of colonialism. So they give and they take, but I don't know if you can talk about equal distribution. But to come to your first question, I think when these Negritude thinkers were trying to understand how to get out of colonialism, they were also thinking about how Fanon in the direction of the earth, that's what he wrote about, how to it would be interesting to be, free from colonialism, but how are you going to build your nations? You need to have, the nation state. What's going to be your nation state? In a nation state, you have to have state apparatuses, right? That Louis Althusser talks about. You have to have, schools, education, so on and so forth, so structures, and then so they were thinking, Césaire was part of the Communist Party, but when he went to, he went to Russia and he realized what was going on. He realized that this was just a pure ideology that was not addressing the issues that Black people were having. So he just resigned. He didn't even discuss that. And economically too, they were looking for different models to adapt in the continent, right? If you are an economist, I'm sure you can talk in length about which kind of economy each country is going through in the continent right now, right? So these are, the issues really is that we need institutions and structures in place to start talking about even economic models, right? So I don't know if, everybody is after money, capitalism is what the world is about today. So then in that way, you can say Africa too, but which kind of capitalism, so that these are the questions. And then also how, I think, for example, in Nigeria, for example, women have decided to boycott banks. They keep their own money and they generate, revenue from their own, money, how they produce money. So, I mean, I'm sure you know about all of that, but I'm just saying here that, it's interesting that, the continent, many places have not found a clear model to adapt to the proper economy that, each country should, have. I think these are the issues. So, and then, I think I answered your other question as well. I mean, as long as we have natural resources, we will have, people ready to come to exploit them. That is simple as that.